Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we take a look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our just general joy of being alive. And of course, you have to talk about sustainable design as well. And we're going to talk about higher education design today. This is really cool. I have Will Gridley from Robert A.M. Stern Architects. Some of you may recognize Robert Stern's name. He was a great educator and author and a practitioner, I believe, Will, of, was it neoclassical design or contemporary classical?
Well, that's a little bit of a misconception. I think he's a very broad designer, I would say. I think he definitely had a specific passion and focus on traditional and classical design, but I think, we'll maybe get into this more if you look at our firm's portfolio. Yes, I think he is recognized for his expertise and passion for traditional and classical design, but I think one of his great strengths is that he could apply those principles to any style of design, many being more contemporary. And if you look at our portfolio, I think you actually can see that in how we approach the design process.
Right on. Well, Will, welcome to the program. I'm sorry I got off on that tangent there.
No, it's all good.
It's wonderful to have you. Thank you for being on the show.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, well, let's start the way I always start, which is allowing our audience to get to know the guests a little better. Tell us a little bit about yourself. First of all, tell us why you chose architecture as a career, and then tell us a little bit about the pathway that led you to being part of R.A.M. Stern Architects, and then talk a little bit about your current role there.
Okay, yeah. I have a pretty unique background, I think. My dad is an architect. He founded and ran a firm in Washington, D.C. for many decades, and he focused on educational design. So I had the very sort of unique perspective as a child of having a parent who did what I do. And growing up, I just always really admired what he did and his work. I found it exciting. I think I was naturally sort of drawn to it, and I was naturally sort of, I inherited some of these skills and sort of creative interests, but I also saw sort of how the work he did and the people he worked with had an impact, and how much he was admired for that work, and how much, within the community, people valued what he did. And so I was both sort of very interested in it because I sort of was good at it and was drawn to it in terms of just the creative side, but also the purpose of it, the impact of it. I saw that, and that really made me want to follow in his footsteps. I was interested in studying architecture in college. My dad gave me some of the best advice I've ever received, which is that the opportunity to go into architecture will be there for a while. It is a professional degree, so you'll have to do additional school for it. Why don't you get a broader liberal arts degree first? Because I think that you can apply to anything. And then after a few years, see if you're still interested. So I got a business degree. And as I was completing college, I was still interested. And so I applied to graduate school. I was very lucky to get into Yale, where I studied architecture. And I came into graduate school also with that background from my undergraduate years of studying business, which I think has shaped who I am as a person, as an architect in many ways, but maybe we'll get into that later. But so I studied at Yale. Bob Stern was the dean there while I studied there. I admired Bob tremendously. I admired RAMSA, which is Robert A.M. Stern Architects, and I really wanted to work here. And one of the reasons was that focus on education, that RAMSA was and is still obviously a nationally renowned practice in education and in higher education. And so I actually sort of launched my career wanting to focus on that. And a lot of people when they're students, that doesn't really occur to them. It's not something they focus on, academic, practice. It's, mixed use, commercial, residential, hospitality. And so I think it's a little bit of a niche, it seems like at first when you go into designing and education, but as everybody learns, as I quickly learned, it's such an interesting, broad, diverse typology. Academic architecture encompasses just about every single building type. I'll just put it that way. Yeah, so that's a long-winded explanation of how I got here.
And you sort of specialize in higher
Yep.
education, right? It's
hmm
sort of basically university buildings and that type. And is that what really attracted you? Is the diversity, the fact that there's just so many different aspects or components that come together to create a learning center at higher level, at university level?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I do a little bit of independent school work as well, which I love too. Our firm just happens to have more of a focus on higher education. But if I had to sort of define why I'm drawn to it succinctly, it's that I think it is a building type with tremendous purpose.
Yeah.
That the buildings themselves are affecting the lives of countless people across generations, that the clients are people who are in it because they are passionate about it. They are not, for many of our clients, these are once in a career opportunities for them to have the chance to design a new building, to shape a campus, and they take it, because of that so seriously and with such passion that it feels like everybody is totally aligned on sort of the mission and what we're trying to do.
Right.
And so it's the passion and the purpose, I guess, behind the work that make it special for me.
I love that. All right, we're going to get into some interesting stuff here. I found this really interesting. I read an article that you wrote recently, and honestly, that article, I could probably do multiple episodes just on that article. So I kind of want to focus on it a lot because it'll tease out some things about your practice, but it also really speaks to some important stuff in school design. So you wrote this article about a residency that you did at Southern Methodist, and early in the article, you give a little history on the evolution of classroom design. And I've never had that background before. Would you mind starting there, sharing a little bit of the history of classroom design so that we sort of get that grounding first?
Well, sure. So, classroom design, obviously, classrooms are sort of the heart and soul of academic buildings. Classroom design has evolved a lot over the last couple of centuries, really, as methods of teaching and practice have evolved. And the esoteric word for that is pedagogy. We talk a lot about pedagogy in my line of work, but as pedagogy has evolved, so has classroom design. Going back to the early 19th century, it was really a more didactic model of learning. It was students facing the front of a room, a teacher lecturing them. And as the 20th century went on, that began to evolve into more sort of engaging, interactive methods of learning and teaching. In the 1920s, the Harkness method, the Harkness table was introduced, for example, and that is, sort of a seminar setting where everybody's facing one another, learning in the round. Harvard Business School famously in the late 1920s, 1930s developed the case study of teaching, and alongside that, a classroom dedicated to that style of learning, so more of a horseshoe configuration where it is learning and discussion in the round, but also focus on a instructor and a teaching wall. And then later in the 20th century, more active learning becoming a popular method of teaching and learning where students are actually interacting and engaging with each other, even getting up out of their seats, using technology, moving around. So models like the Kiva classroom and the scale up classroom sort of emerged. And so there's been this sort of evolution of static learning focused on the instructor to much more active. And I think that has several facets that have sort of played out in different ways. But that, broadly speaking, that is sort of the history, I guess.
Blinds, the ultimate design feature. Nothing says architectural vision like a building covered in slats and cords, right? Of course not. Everyone hates them. They're fiddly inside and ugly outside. So why plan for them at all? Solera gives you glare-free daylight, no blinds required. Clean, simple, and exactly what you wanted people to see in the first place. Let's work together. Visit advancedglazings.com to get started.
Okay, well, let's dive into your article because you're saying some really cool stuff in there. So, what you talk about is the need for variety in the system, the variety of classrooms. In other words, there's no one classroom that's suited for every course. You argue, and this is really important here, you argue that a room's geometry, furniture, and technology placement subtly shapes students' attention, engagement, and group work. All right. And you're putting forth that there must be more variety in classroom design to suit, like you say, the different courses. First, can you explain this idea of the different needs for different courses, just from a broad perspective first, and then we'll dive down into some details?
Sure. I think to sort of hit on the point you were making, that we're often asked the question, what is the perfect classroom? And the answer to that is there is no perfect classroom. It depends on a lot of factors. And I think the approach isn't identifying the classroom and deploying it, at scale. It is identifying the right portfolio of classrooms. And so that depends on the size of the class, the format of the class, the subject of the class, obviously, and more recently with technology issues like hybrid learning. But for example, lecture-based classes, obviously still sort of, fundamental aspect of higher education learning. That really lends itself to more of a lecture style seating of tiers that are sloped towards the front of a room with a large legible board. If you're talking about seminar classrooms or case discussion classrooms, you need to design the classroom so that students can effectively, be in conversation with each other. It's really hard to turn around and talk to somebody. You don't want to be doing that. You want to be able to just sit and face forward and be able to have that conversation. And then, more collaborative classes, things like, as I saw, classes on negotiations, that actually it's more than just conversation. It's getting up and moving around and forming teams. Furniture in those classrooms need to be totally different. You can't have rows as much because it prohibits you from sort of moving around. You actually start to think about forming clusters of furniture and round tables and things like that, but designing it in such a way that it doesn't prohibit you from being able to face the front of a room and hear a lecture. You have to sort of bridge those two things together.
Right. Okay. Let's go into some specifics. You mentioned 5 courses in the article, and I'm going to list them all, and then I'm going to ask you to explain what you observed in each of those 5 classes. All right. And these are, just for our audience, these are classes that Will actually, observed, attended in order to watch how things went. So anyway, I'll mention each of the classes, and maybe you tell us a little bit about the classroom design that you witnessed on that day or those days, and how it either enhanced or detracted from the learning environment. Is that fair?
Sure, I'll try. Yeah. See how good my memory is.
All right, let's give it a go. The first one was the Introduction to Marketing course. Tell us what you observed in there.
So that was a small class. So it was in one of the smaller classrooms, lecture-based classroom, and that involved students getting up and giving pitches at the front of the room in groups. So I think just sort of the intimacy of that classroom was good, that students could really be focused on one another, and that, it really required the ability for people to give feedback. So I think just sort of the tightness of the room and the scale of the room worked well for that. And just the layout in terms of the students having several whiteboards to work with and also digital boards above it was effective for how they delivered their presentation.
Right on. And was there anything there that wasn't right for that class? Anything that you'd change for them that would enhance learning even further, Will?
Yeah, I think one of the things, a theme of this residency was learning about how much even the tiniest practical details matter. And some are tinier than others, I guess. But, I think in the design process, we're so focused on so many things, big picture, big ideas. We'll probably come back to that. But going back to the details, in that classroom, because the classroom had been designed around an instructor at the front of the room.
Right.
It turns out when you get 10 people at the front of the room, it gets pretty tight. So
right.
In terms of how we lay out the lectern, which is, the sort of teaching command station, and the front row, and even in some cases, the confidence monitors that are up in the front of the room, I think understanding the full range of uses and knowing that rooms would be used, say, for presentations from large groups of people may have impacted how we designed the front of the room, and we may have, in that particular room, maybe had a little bit more breathing space.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk about the financial accounting class. Was there anything special there, Will? Any good learnings from that?
The financials class was really strictly a lecture-based class, students facing the front of the room, watching the instructor deliver a lesson on building financial models in Excel. So it required the ability to be very focused and be able to read lines of Excel on a display screen. And so I guess what was sort of striking going from the marketing class to the finance class I was immediately like, oh, wow, I see how different these classes are now. Like in the last class, it was a discussion, it was active, it was students speaking. In this class, everybody is dialed into their laptops, punching in Excel, watching a lecture. And so I started to appreciate, in that moment what I had always understood, but it feels different when you experience it. It was a similar classroom, interestingly, to the marketing one, but I think it was in that class that I gained a better appreciation for what we call the sort of principles of classroom design or geometric principles of classroom design. There are all these rules that we follow, in regards to screen height, view depth, viewing angles. For example, you take the height of a screen. You want to be no closer to that screen than 1 times its height and no further than 6 times its height. That's sort of the range at which your eyes, are able to read it legibly. And so, being in a class where people are literally reading lines of Excel and ensuring that, all 70 students are able to do that, I think really it was just sort of a powerful demonstration of why these principles are so important.
That's really interesting. Yeah, you know what? And it was a really good reminder for me, Will, as to why I took marketing in my MBA instead of financial accounting. So thanks for that affirmation. Let's talk about negotiations, the negotiation class. Anything interesting there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the negotiations class was in what we call a cluster style classroom. So rather than rows, it's a mix of rows that are broken up with oval shaped tables between them. It's a little bit hard to describe without an image, but it allows everybody to face the front of the room and then for half the class to turn around from the desks to the tables and form groups of 5 or 7 people. And so it's perfect for a class like negotiations because the instructor can give a lecture and then he can tell the students to break out in their groups and prepare for a negotiation exercise. And then the students can stand up and move around to face off against other teams in those negotiations. So it's this sort of fluidity in the teaching process of lecture to group to, moving around to engage with other groups. So it was the first class I took in the cluster style, and it was sort of the perfect class to demonstrate the functionality of that classroom.
I like it. All right, that's cool. All right, let's do one more. I'm kind of enjoying this. What managerial decision making? That class. That sounds like it might be in the middle somewhere between the financial accounting sort of detail that's required, but simultaneously you need some conversation too. Is that a good read? What did you learn in that particular class?
Okay, honestly, I'm trying to recall which one that was. Was it the one in the auditorium? I'm trying to remember. Do you know?
I do not.
Okay, I might be mixing something up, but still, I think the principles is what matters. The managerial decision-making class was a large class that took place in the auditorium. It was part of the core curriculum, and it required large groups of students to be taught at once. And so it was a totally different environment. It took place in a 400-person auditorium. It didn't completely fill the auditorium, but interestingly, the auditorium was sort of designed for that scenario. But I think it was an interesting demonstration in how large classrooms can function effectively and how acoustic and visual reinforcement tools and technology make that possible. In this class, I gained an appreciation just for how important and effective audio and visual, reinforcement and amplification are.
Right.
The sound system, the microphone and speaker system allowed everybody in the auditorium from the front row to the back row to hear clearly. And there were also screens mounted throughout the auditorium that allowed everybody to see the material being presented clearly.
Right. So I'm going way off script here, but is there language that describes when you have a scenario where there's just really not going to be any sort of intimacy between the professor and the students, right? You got 400 people in a lecture hall. I would think there's very little intimacy, whereas, a smaller group where there's lots of interaction and conversation, like when you describe the negotiation, the clustered design. Is there language for that, or does it matter? Or, do you have a way of describing when you have a low intimacy classroom?
I've never been asked that question before.
Just curious.
I don't have a good answer for you.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. That means it's not something that's spoken of. I was just curious.
Well, I mean, yeah, sorry. I don't think I have a good answer for that.
Well, then let's not dwell on it then. Let's just move on. I want to talk about the four takeaways that you listed in your article because I thought they were kind of interesting and I wanted to go a little deeper on them. So these are four takeaways or learnings from that experience at SMU. The first one, the subtle patterns of how students learn. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, Will?
Of course, I think I commented a little bit on this in my prior example of the front of the room being sort of too tight for groups, but it's the importance of subtle details. It is how backpacks hit a wall as a student turns around and the zippers scratch it. And it's about how 2 more inches of desk space allow you to have a sheet of paper in front of your laptop so you can look at the handout. It's things like that. It's, we spend all this time designing classrooms so obsessively, and then we slap monitors on the walls without really thinking enough about exactly how they get viewed from different positions in the room. I think it's exactly why the residency was valuable, that until you sort of experience it, you can't appreciate it and understand how important it is.
Right. So the second one was the power of physical presence, which I imagine you mean like actually having the kids in the classroom versus remote learning. Is that what you're referring to?
It is, yeah.
And where does the power come from? Where's the power in that and them actually being there in the classroom?
The power, I think, is that learning is a very social thing. And I really felt that as I sat in on these classrooms, things like eye contact that trigger laughter and things like that really enrich the experience. And it was interesting because, obviously these students were sort of victims of the remote learning situation in high school. And I think they're a little bit scarred from that, frankly. And, without prompting them, they talked about how much it meant to be together in person. In that marketing class, it actually came up and it was remarkable. There's energy that comes from being in person, and there's a social aspect of it that adds a totally necessary dimension to learning that just can't be experienced online, I think.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that, online learning is a terrific thing, and it definitely has its place in higher education, no question about it, but it can't replace it.
Right on. Yeah, I agree entirely. The third one is the use of technology. Was there anything particular in there, Will, that you were speaking to? Anything that really sort of caught your eye or, was holy cow sort of moment for you?
I think the takeaway was that technology is something that is best used, I think, as a background rather than a foreground. In my opinion, it shouldn't be the center of attention. It should support all of the things that need to happen. But I think when it's front and center, when it is the sort of feature, the instructor sort of becomes the backdrop. And also you are at the mercy of the technology so that, a lot of it works really well if you understand exactly how to use it. But if somebody is in the room and doesn't understand it, or if there's an issue, everything falls apart. Right. So you have to be able to fall back on just the sort of traditional old school methods of teaching. And also, there's the fact that inevitably these classrooms have to serve teachers that all have their individual teaching styles. And there's no one technological solution to that. There has to be a suite of tools, in some cases, the literal chalkboard to the, hologram being projected or whatever. That all has to be there and it has to be available, but it has to be designed in such a way that it doesn't take over the room and actually inhibit, the overall effectiveness.
Right. Okay. The last one I don't understand. So this one I need some help with. This is interesting. You said the uncertain future. What are you referring to there?
I am referring to the fact that humans will never be able to predict the future, and we have to avoid trying to do that and instead focus on designing spaces that can adapt over time. So don't try to design for what you think is going to happen in 20 years. Design something that is flexible and adaptable so that as technology takes us in unpredictable directions, you don't have to, tear apart your building and totally renovate it. And I think if you just look back historically, I think we find that as certain trends emerged, design really focused on sort of trying to keep up with that. And then in the next stage, it sort of backfired. And, one sort of simple practical example is as class sizes grew and, in the case study classrooms, for example, as they really became popular in the mid 20th century, a number of them were designed and constructed and concrete was poured to support the tiers. Well, when you want to change that, when the class cohort size gets bigger or when you want a different type of classroom, you've got concrete in your way. And it's very complicated and expensive to change. So just simple things like that, of even the materials you use to construct a classroom, it has to be something that can change over time.
Are glare and heat problems leaving you in the hot seat? A revolutionary solution is here. Psst, it's not blinds. Visit advancedglazings.com/glare repair to learn more.
Right. Okay. I want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. I want to talk about daylight and views in the. I mean, everybody in this world of academia knows the Heschong-Mahon studies, and that, with the presence of daylight and views, there was a significant increase in academic performance. Do you think we're doing a good job bringing full spectrum natural light into classrooms?
I do. I think we're doing a better job of it. I think one of the reasons that we got away from it was projector technology. That for a long time, light glare made it, before projectors were as advanced as they are today, you had to put the blinds down. And so these classrooms always had their blinds down. So as a result of that, people thought you didn't need windows in classrooms. Now, obviously, with better projectors and digital displays, that's not nearly as much of an issue. So we're able to get all these benefits, obviously that you're an expert on, in classrooms that can still function, very effectively. And we still have to think about things like, heat gain and glare and all of that. But I think there's no question that students and professors, they gravitate towards the classrooms with natural light. I will say sometimes there are constraints where it's not possible to have windows, or where, there's basement space that is available where it makes sense to have classrooms. And I think also, as lighting has come a long way in terms of mimicking natural daylight and things like that. And then you have to, I think, in developing that suite of classrooms, think about certain types that may actually benefit from not having natural light. And so, computer rooms, which, yes, are still a thing because of, expensive and complex software, things like that. Trading labs, for example, those are often sort of well suited for windowless spaces. Similarly, auditoriums, generally, you want to not necessarily have windows. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about materials before we go. I want to make sure that we cover that. Do you have any insights about materials that can change, that, just create a better learning environment, a more appropriate learning environment? Is it possible to use materials to help with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think we've known for a long time ourselves that they affect the psyche, and science has obviously proven that. But I think that I would divide it maybe into three categories of how materials can affect learning. The first is just the psychological, natural materials, warm colors, things that just sort of enhance people's moods and reduce cognitive fatigue. Materials have a real effect on that. The second is the functional, just thinking about things like acoustic absorption, reverberation. The materials very much have an effect on acoustics and the legibility of speech. And if you teach in a classroom that has a giant window wall and doesn't have the right acoustic treatment on the other wall, there's echo that, creates a major issue. And then the third is, I guess, just the more practical side, just, durability. Students are tough on classrooms. I'll just put it that way. You get beat up. And so you have to think about the durability, maintainability. You have to think about cleaning them, things like that. So that's how I would categorize it.
Right on. One big picture question. How much have you changed? How much has your practice changed as a result of the things that you learned at Southern Methodist?
Well, I would say I came back from that residency, as I call it, saying we have to do this on every single project because, oh my gosh, did I just learn a lot. Right. So I think it has definitely created a greater appreciation for that. And we're making efforts to do that on more of our projects when it's possible. Like people say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, sitting in the space is worth a million words. I'll just put it that way. So I think a focus on doing that. And then also just a focus on paying attention to the details and not losing sight of it as you get into architecture. There are so many issues and challenges to deal with. And, it's easy to lose sight of some of the idea of a zipper hitting a wall. And when you do that, you've got to fix things 3 years later. So you really have to focus on that. So those are the two ways I think it's affected me the most.
Very cool. All right. We've reached the point in the show where I ask my $1 million question, Will, and I ask every guest the same question.
Sure.
So here we go. What makes a great building?
Oh, man. I'm sure everybody gives you the same response, that is a big question. I will try to answer it sort of through the lens, I guess, of campus buildings a little bit, although this is relevant to any building type, but it starts with the context. So with the campus, or if it's, an urban building with the urban environment, whatever, but it's a building that enhances its environment. A great building is a building that enhances its environment more broadly. It forms a relationship, a dialogue with the buildings and the landscape around it. It frames outdoor space. It sort of shapes its greater context. In terms of its design, it represents a moment in time of the history of the campus. And it's sort of, part of that dialogue I talked about, that it needs to feel like it belongs, but it also has to push ideas forward. And then I think as you get into the building itself, it has to be intuitive. It has to be clear where the front door is. As you enter the building, it has to be clear to you without reading a sign what's going on and where you need to go. It needs to invite people in. It needs to be welcoming. It needs to be a place where students want to hang out and spend the day. That I think historically, campus buildings, classroom buildings were designed to serve a specific function where students would come in and then get out of there. And now we're designing spaces where we want students to stay, and buildings that support a higher level of engagement, of interaction, that, unplanned encounters, collisions, a place where the unexpected things happen, where you meet somebody that you didn't plan to meet, whether it's a student or a faculty member or a staff member. And I think that's what the higher education experience is all about. It's about discovery, learning, and doing that in ways that are not necessarily planned or expected. So I guess all the way from the campus context down to the sort of the individual experience of being in a building, I think that's what makes a great building. I could obviously go on a lot longer, but that's what came to mind.
I love it. All right. Well, before we go, do you have any announcements? Is there anything exciting happening with Ramza, with you personally? Any sort of public appearances coming up? Anything that you want to promote?
Oh my gosh, there's so much going on at our firm. And, one of the reasons I love working here is that just the range of our work is so broad and what we do is so broad. My next public appearance, I'm speaking in May at a conference, Facades Plus conference, in Washington, D.C. on the design of our McCourt School of Public Policy facade at Georgetown University. And so, going from a classroom podcast to a technical presentation on facade design and construction sort of illustrates the breadth of what we do. But a lot of interesting and exciting projects also. We have a new central library opening at James Madison University this summer. That is one that I'm particularly interested in doing another residency in, just because I think of all campus building types, the library is the one that has changed the most in the last few decades. And so I really am eager to get in there and see how students use it.
Right on. Well, thank you so much. That was a really cool experience. I learned a whole lot there. I appreciate you coming in. Yeah, thank you for your time, and thank you for the really important insights.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I really appreciate it. It's great chatting with you, and this is fun.
For sure. You take care.
All right. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.